And welcome to Civil Discourse. I'm Jamie Wojciechowski.
And I'm Marilyn Brown. And
And this, oh, go ahead.
I was just
You
going to say, and
launch it.
Jamie has a quote for us today to start us off.
Awesome. It is a quote by Gary Zukov. The winter solstice has always been special to me as a barren darkness that gives birth to a verdant future beyond imagination. A time of pain and withdrawal that produces something joyfully inconceivable, like a monarch butterfly masterfully extracting itself from the confines of its cocoon, bursting forth into unexpected glory.
Wow,
It's
that's
very
really
poetic.
beautiful. Yeah, that's a really beautiful quote. So, I don't know, that immediately just that really resonated with me just today because I feel like I'm feeling the season right now. Even though it's 80 degrees in LA or like in the 70s and it doesn't feel like that season where you go inward like it there's definitely I'm feeling just kind of more pensive lately, just kind of more quiet, more like a little bit more, I don't know if it's down, but just kind of lower energy and I can see that in a lot of the people around me and in my clients. And so it's interesting because I think this is a time where like we're expected to be very joyous and, excited and in a celebratory mood with the holidays. But I think like the other side is that there is just kind of this seasonal lull that we have at this time and it's an interesting kind of contrast to that expectation
Right.
of joyousness.
Yeah. And I mean, the winter solstice is on the 21st, so it's
Okay.
a week away. And what I love about this quote is the non-duality of it in a way, of the contrast between talking about a time that is more barren and about almost about death in a way, about a
Mhm.
nature kind of dying and then coming into a type of rebirth
Yeah.
in the spring, and it's that kind of contrast. So it's interesting listening to you talk about not necessarily the nature itself, but kind of the way mankind has created this time of year, and
Hmm.
that it is kind of a calmer, colder, even if not in temperature. It's a darker time, and yet we've added so much importance on holidays and various things that keep the energy kind of at a peak for the year in a lot of ways. So it's interesting that even I think that duality exists as as a very strong role in nature, and even when we try to separate ourselves from nature, there's still that element that's there.
Yeah, definitely. And that kind of death rebirth period, I think that like in nature we expect it and we I think some welcome it, but we expect it. We know there's not always a growing season. We recognize that like there's seasons and there's times where there's you harvest and then there's nothing and things look very barren and yet there's growth happening underneath. There's still stuff, the plants are still alive, and so I think we expect that with nature, but with ourselves we don't really give ourselves permission to have those slower seasons, those seasons where we do go inward and where we're not necessarily as productive. And it's difficult because our world isn't set up to have those seasons. For most people, we have to work year round. We don't really have an opportunity, like people did thousands of years ago when we were completely agricultural, when there was nothing growing, there wasn't really a lot to do. And so you kind of had to go inward and allow that time of rest, but we're not really set up to do that in our societies. But yet that's kind of, I think, that natural pull to slow down and to allow ourselves this time to go inward and kind of be more reflective in order to be ready for the spring, and for that more active season, that growing season. I think that like, again, with plants, it's not like they're dead when there's nothing on the surface. When you can't see the plants, they're still, they're still taking nutrients. They're still doing that work with the roots underneath the surface. And so kind of recognizing that like that's how they're able to bloom, fully and beautifully in the spring. But we don't really allow that for ourselves. And so that's kind of something I've been thinking about more, but also like trying to give myself permission to do, and try to help my clients give themselves permission to find ways where you can allow yourself to slow down and be more in line with what the season is calling us to do.
Right. I think it's interesting too. It's something I've been thinking a lot about, and is just our relationship with nature, and how as as a society we kind of often see ourselves as separate from nature. We try to separate ourselves from it, but the reality of it and the science of it is that we are completely interconnected, whether we acknowledge it or not. And I think a lot of the issues we have as a culture, just the the heightened psychological issues that seem to be growing every year, and the cultural problems and the political problems. I think a lot of it stems from us trying to separate ourselves from nature. And the reality is that no matter how much we try to separate ourselves both physically or mentally from that connection, the connection's there. So I think a lot of those kind of negative outcomes are part of that, are results of kind of that struggle that our bodies know, and our I think our innate beings know that we are completely interconnected with all of nature, which means each other and everything around us, even though we fight against that principle. Uh, and I think just with the winter solstice, I think it's great. Going off of what you're talking about is just the difficulty in our human lives to remember nature and to feel that connection and to slow down. I think a way to do that is to just incorporate that awareness into whatever holidays you celebrate. Like I don't think you need to celebrate winter solstice as its own thing. You very well can. I do.
Mm-hmm.
But I think just even if you're celebrating Hanukkah, or if you're celebrating Christmas, or whatever it is, if you just bring a little awareness to nature during that time, I think you will see a benefit, and see kind of that connection, and be able to feel calm and whatever that, if that's just going for a walk and appreciating lights on trees, or whatever it is. I think just finding a moment to really be in nature, and feel that connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like that. I think that that's a very mindful way to kind of to be aware of the season and to incorporate that into where we're at, and into kind of culturally how we already do things. I think that makes so much sense. And that connection to nature, I think that, like, for myself, I find that when I'm able to intentionally take those moments and find a way to connect to nature with whatever that is, it really does create a sense of peace for me. And it's not permanent, right? Nothing is permanent, but it does create this kind of sense of peace. And I think it is that reminder that we are connected to everything. It's kind of that, I think a lot of times we are very anxious, very kind of just feeling like we're spinning out,
Hmm.
like kind of like we're not anchored to anything. And that reminder, that connection to nature, whatever kind of those moments are, like if I go and I just literally just will go, and there's a park like a block away from my house, and so sometimes I'll just go, and there's like this really cool tree, and I'll just sit on the roots of that tree for maybe like 5 or 10 minutes. It doesn't even have to be that long, but I find that I just don't feel as lost as I did before I got there. Like I feel anchored by something. And I think you're right. It's just that reminder that we are connected, that we're not just kind of spinning out in the universe on our own, that we're connected to everything. And if we can take those moments, that it really does help kind of create peace.
Hmm. Yeah, and the other thing I love about going back to the quote is the metaphor with monarch butterfly,
Mm.
and kind of this idea that, and I'll read again. It's like a monarch butterfly masterfully extracting itself from the confines of its cocoon, bursting forth into unexpected glory. And I think that it has so many different things I love about it. It has the whole idea of the unexpected, and not really knowing, being in the moment is not knowing what's going to happen, but it's preparing yourself to be able to deal with whatever comes in a mindful way because you're already present. And I think that's very much, I mean, the a caterpillar doesn't know it's going to become a butterfly. It goes through these steps in the moment that lead to that, and to nurturing the conditions to develop into something. And I think the other thing I love about it is also the kind of the struggle in it, because I think we've talked about this before. For a lot of people, this is a time, both in the holidays and going into New Year's, it's a time where people do self-reflect, and that self-reflection can bring up a lot of pain and a lot of struggle and a lot of regret for a lot of people. And I think that the metaphor for the butterfly is interesting because it implies, at least when I think about it, there's an implied pain in that kind of growth,
Yeah.
of cocooning yourself and really just kind of, I mean, I think that the metaphor of the cocoon is, I mean, you're basically just sheltering, you're surrounding yourself, there's no movement, you're just kind of closing something in order to grow and to develop. And I think there's a sense of pain there. So
Yeah.
I think with the rebirth, just, and it's not about being appreciative of the pain or any of that, of just understanding that that pain and that death in a way, or that barren nature is part of the rebirth.
Right. Right. That pain is an avenue kind of to that next step, and I
Right.
think that's a lot of times where we struggle, that, we want to get to that next part, but we don't want to feel that pain. We don't want to actually experience that. And so I think that you're right. When when that caterpillar goes into the cocoon, it's totally just mindful of being in whatever that moment is. So it's feeling whatever it's going through in the transformation process, and that growth of kind of bursting out as the butterfly later. But I think for us, we pull away from that. We want to numb out the feelings. And so a lot of times this season brings up a lot of just kind of difficulties with past trauma and things for people. And understandably so, we don't want to feel that pain. And our initial reaction is to pull away and to find some way to numb it out or to avoid it. And I think that, unfortunately, that kind of just keeps it there, and it keeps it stuck, and we're not able to kind of move through that pain and actually experience it, and let it go in the process of kind of that death rebirth.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're continuing to carry that pain. And yeah, I think that makes sense, there's got to be like a surrender to it, almost like a surrender, of full acceptance of, this is the experience right now. This is what I'm experiencing right now. This is whatever has come up for me right now, and allowing yourself to kind of feel that so that you can be in that next space and be ready to receive the unexpected in the future.
Right. And yeah, I think it is interesting because I think that is the reason why a lot of people struggle to cope with certain things, or achieve the goals they want to achieve, or whatever it is because they're focused on where they want to go, and also kind of controlling what's happening now. So
Mm-hmm.
in the caterpillar thing, like with the what you were talking about, the pain, getting through the pain, the cocoon is the pain. And so many people are the caterpillars who want to just become the butterfly, but they want to skip the cocoon stages,
Right.
and that's what creates the butterfly. So I
Right.
think just the awareness of it, because I think the other problem is that most people aren't aware that they're skipping that stage. They don't see
Right.
that stage as a caterpillar doesn't. I don't think a caterpillar says, "Ooh, it's time for me to be in a cocoon now." They just are embracing what's natural. And I think that's an important
Mhm.
thing about pain, about excitement, about any emotions is we we are animals. We are nature, and we feel these things for a reason. We're wired to feel for a specific reason. So I think running away from it is stopping
Mhm.
potential growth and stopping us from being able to move on and do these things. And that's true with positive emotions, with negative emotions, with wherever you're at.
Mhm. Mhm. Right. Yeah, I think that, we tend to want to avoid those negative emotions more, but I definitely think that, there's that it's that just kind of resistance to it that actually keeps it around,
Hmm.
and it's that quote, it's whatever you resist persists. I don't know who quoted that, but I've heard it for a very long time and it makes sense, but it's like I don't think we realize that we're resisting it. I think it's just reactions. It's like if you touch a hot stove, you pull your hand away. It's just kind of these automatic, I feel triggered, this is uncomfortable, let me pull away, rather than like
Hmm.
being able to. And I think this comes with the practice of mindfulness, when you're able to sit in the emotions and have that awareness and kind of intentionally be observing what
Hmm.
comes up and what doesn't, versus kind of being in it where we are kind of most of the time in our lives. I think that's what really allows you to use that information, because I think when we avoid the feeling, we miss the message, and our feelings, our emotions are communicating something to us. And so if we are avoiding, that feeling, then we're not able to receive that message and kind of know what to do with it and how to move forward.
Right. And I think too culturally, we at least in the West, we've created our societies to, and I don't think we intentionally did this. I think it was just an outcome of kind of an industrializing and separating ourselves from nature. Is we've created the conditions to make it really easy to uh, push emotions aside and to hide in these things. I think if we were in cultures that were much more community based and nature based, where we would have those connections, I think we would naturally embrace them more. But because we've created a society of dualism that's very separate, and in a lot of ways very ego driven, I think it just gives us a lot of, it kind of cultivates that hiding and that pushing away and that fear and that shame. And I think there's just so many emotions that come along with it for many different reasons. But it's interesting because I'm trying to think, well, how natural is it for us as humans to do that,
Mhm.
versus how much of that has been a byproduct of the societies we've created,
Right.
right? And it's
Yeah.
I mean, it's most likely a combination of the two, but
Right. Yeah, but no, that is interesting, because as you were talking about that, I was just thinking of, the long list of things, in my own life that are just such active distractions that I really have to like do so much work to kind of find that, okay, I'm numbing out by doing this. I'm not allowing myself to experience my life when I'm, overly focusing on like watching the news or something like that, or binging Netflix or something, like just realizing there's so many different things that we are surrounded by um, that allow us to check out and actually
mhm.
support us in checking out, and actually that's kind of, there's like a culture built around checking out. And so I think that it is interesting to kind of think about, like, is the checking out the natural part, or is it like, where would we be if we didn't have all of these kind of tools to avoid?
Right. And I think too, I think that the natural part, I'm thinking, I recently had a death in the family, and when I was home, I was observing kind of my own and others kind of coping mechanisms.
Hmm.
And what I tend to do is I tend to like to instantly be of service. So I like to stay as busy as possible, helping whoever needs help. And that's kind of my coping mechanism.
Yeah,
And it's interesting because it's, I guess, a positive coping mechanism is that I'm being of service. But at the end of the day, it is a way for me to kind of avoid feeling what I'm actually feeling and kind of and hide it. And at the same time, I think it does help. That specific coping mechanism helps move that energy a little bit because it's still in my focus is to connect with people and to be of service, but it's still a defense mechanism for me to not feel. So it's interesting because it's not just a black and white issue.
totally.
It's there's so much
Hmm.
gray area in it.
Yeah, it's very nuanced. That's something that a lot of us therapists kind of have, is that, we recognize that part of this work allows us to not to kind of not avoid our own stuff, but to focus on other people and be of service and help, and not, help others kind of deal with their stuff, but also recognizing that we also have our own work that needs to be done. And it can be very easy to avoid that when you're focusing on helping others. And so that's kind of that balance is learning. Because I do think that helping others and being of service is a coping skill. And I think it can really, like you said, help move that energy. But I also think it's very easy to overly focus on that and avoid your own stuff. And so it's kind of that, I mean, with anything, there needs to be a balance.
Right. Yeah, and I think with the quote in general, that's what I think the overarching theme is for me. And just in solstices in general, whether it's the summer solstice or the winter solstice, the thing that I connect to is the balance of nature, and just the poetry kind of surrounding it. And I mean the literal poetry of humans expressing themselves in art when they represent nature as a very balanced kind of experience.
Mm.
Plus, I think the science of it and the technical aspect of it is a very balanced reality. So I
Hmm.
think that I think it's a good time to check in with ourselves to see where that balance is, and
Yeah.
if it's off kilter, how we can move it more towards being balanced. And I think it's about finding where you're at and moving where you can, because I think it's in the society we live in, it's very hard to be balanced all the time. And I think it's a little
Yes.
unrealistic because even in nature is about balance. For me isn't a state of being. It's a fluctuating
Yes.
process.
Exactly.
So, and I
Yep.
think that once I started understanding that and seeing that in myself, is that it's a process that I'm constantly in. The pressure to stay balanced and always be calm and these things kind of just went away, and I was a little more accepting of what the reality is.
Yes. I love that. I love that, like, that recognition that the solstice is seeking that balance. And but there's only, if we recognize that there's only two solstices per year, so there's only two times where the earth is fully imbalanced, and the rest of the time it's doing what we're doing. So it's kind of seeking that balance. And so I think it actually can teach us compassion for ourselves, of kind of recognizing, like, I can't expect myself to be balanced all the time. Like you said, I have to recognize that, like, it's constantly a state of flux. There's constantly fluctuations, and it's a process. And when you're able to be mindful of that, there's so much less pressure to kind of meet a goal and get to a place and then just be there and stay there, because the earth doesn't do that. The nature doesn't do that. So why would we expect that of ourselves? Um,
Right.
yeah, that's one of those really, I think, really beautiful things when we kind of think about the solstice as a whole, is it's like that, those 2 points where there's that much balance, but then the rest of the time there's constantly that kind of motion of moving towards that.
Right. And it's interesting, and thinking about balance. I'm trying to think, well, what does that actually mean. And in context of the solstices, for it's really just a tipping point. It's what from moving from one stage into the next, and it's really just with the, I mean, the sun is really what it comes down to. It's just if we go from the day of the sun being at its lowest to starting to be longer and longer each day, and I think too, it's a great representation of the extreme, right, of rebirth. But the reality and the other thing I see in it is that rebirth can happen at any moment, and because we are in a process of trying to balance ourselves, there's no specific time where rebirth needs to happen. I think of this every time
Mhm.
New Year's resolutions and all these come out, and I think it's great to use when we are in these heightened states and we can really see the example of that rebirth to then reflect. But I think it's also important to remember that rebirth is happening every moment. So you can pick to have that change at any time. It doesn't have to be on a specific date within a specific event.
Right, right. It's a kind of a more gradual evolution process, and there's changes happening, constantly. Yeah, I think that's something that we I think we look for like those very dramatic shifts in ourselves, and we kind of expect those dramatic shifts. But when I this is something that I actually like to do during this time is I journal a lot, and so like around now I'll kind of start going through old journals and just kind of reading things, and that actually really helps me recognize how much growth has happened over the years that I haven't really noticed or given myself any kind of credit for, recognition for, kind of just recognizing, oh, wow, all of this has happened. And I was focused on looking at like very big kind of dramatic things. But when I actually look back over the time, I realized that there's this growth and this rebirth that's kind of happening gradually throughout the process.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's just because, I mean, we are in the process of rebirth and growth and fluctuation of balance at all times. So because we're experiencing that, I think it is harder to sense every little change because we're always changing. We would be constantly just being like, oh, I changed there, I changed there, I changed there, something is new. So I think we look for those bigger kind of representations of change because they're just easier to be aware of.
Mhm.
And I think those are important to celebrate. What I love about yours, and I'm just thinking about mine too. What is interesting is you see the big thing, but then as you reflect deeper, you start to see all the little steps that got you there. And without one of those small things, you probably wouldn't have been able to climb the ladder to the one achievement you're looking at.
Exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. Now I'm excited for next week in the winter solstice.
I know. I know. The 21st is it exactly. It's Thursday, so it's a week from today.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm excited too. I've just kind of become just started paying more attention to the solstice and to kind of trying to pay more attention to nature and give myself permission to follow nature a little bit more. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, the solstice is always kind of an exciting time now just to be able to look at like where I've gone, where I'm headed and be content with where I'm at right in this moment.
Yeah. I guess for homework, I'm just curious how people, I guess, celebrate the solstice because for me, I mean, I don't do I try each year to find a place in nature that's as separated from civilization as I can find where I'm at, and I just sit for a little bit without my phone, without any electronics, without anything, and just kind of experience, I guess, nature, listen, and try to engage my senses in nature for just a time and appreciate it. And then I go back to my life.
I
So
love
nothing huge, but I'm just curious how people kind of bring, both celebrate it if you celebrate, but also kind of bring the metaphor and the meaning of the solstice into this time of year.
Yeah, sounds good. I want to hear that as well.
Awesome. And you can let us know on Twitter or Facebook. We have a Facebook group, and it's Mindfulness in Action Civil Discourse.
All right. Thank you
Have a
guys. We'll
great
see you next
week.